coming on to another idea that I learned through kind of learning, researching your work. You have this term you call child exceptionalism. Could you kind of like explain what that term means, especially in your work?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's another one that's a bit like social reproduction. It's so familiar in people's lives, and yet we often don't have a name for it. And it's so familiar, it just seems normal and natural. But child exceptionalism kind of refers to the sense that um, we often see that children are the child. So I'm not talking about individual specific flesh and blood children. I'm talking about this idea of the child. The idea of the child is sort of put up on a pedestal as the sort of ultimate deserving uh, figure that's so deserving of protection and care over and above all else. Now, the reason I think it's really important to say this isn't about real children, but it's about a kind of figure or an imagination of the child, is because actually many children are sort of excluded from this idea of child exceptionalism, the idea that children should be protected at all costs. So we can think about examples from the way that, in the ongoing Israeli genocide against Palestine, the way children are unchilded, to use Nader Kevorkian's term. So the idea that children or young people are dispossessed from this category, they're not allowed to belong to it, as a way of justifying attacks on children. So let me just talk this through. So while child exceptionalism would say children should be protected at all costs, by unchilding Palestinian children, it somehow makes it acceptable, or there's a rationale that's provided for their murder. We can see this anywhere from news media saying something like a 3-year-old Palestinian lady was shot today. I mean, this is the kind of the extent to which that unchilding happens, which means that the ideas about protection no longer exist for this individual.
Yeah, I think in a culture where that the idea of like child exceptionalism exists, and when you grow up in that culture and you see how it doesn't really play out in practice, it is kind of a jarring thing to have. And the example you gave is such a perfect example of what's happening to the Palestinian children who are being unchilded, as opposed, and even more locally, we kind of feel that, especially my generation in our lives, where we feel like we were told all these policies and all these welfare systems were being put in place for our benefit, but actually it's not been the case. How was this idea kind of developed in your research? What are some of the kind of I guess the people have you spoken to, or some of the examples you found that kind of come back to this idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes through when we look at the idea of child exceptionalism versus marginalized children's experiences.
Mm,
And there it becomes really obvious in the ways that you've just been saying. So quite often these ideas of kind of protecting children actually harm and hurt the adults that they spend time with,
mm,
separate them from the adults they spend time with,
mm,
and actually don't produce any kind of uh, support for children, and instead may end up kind of justifying their containment in some ways. So that's a kind of general comment. But what does that mean really concretely? I think that we could think about, for example, the ways that for many families who have no recourse to public funds because of their immigration status in the UK. So this is they're told that you don't deserve access to the welfare system and we're not going to support you. Well, the Children's Act says, but hang on, all children are jurisdiction, no matter what their immigration status, deserve to be supported, right? they are covered by the Children's Act. So there's a kind of tension here. On the one hand, there's this sort of child exceptionalism, and on the other hand, there's a sort of dismissal of a family because of their immigration status. And what we see in our research with these families is that sometimes families are able to get a bit of support through this, but for the most part, it ends up being like moms who are blamed for their children's situation, moms who are treated as though they are fraudulent or suspicious, often in highly racialized ways. And so for the children, while this may provide a little bit of support, it quite often ends up being in quite dire circumstances, and I can talk about what it actually enables for these children, which is very little, but it also means it's a quite difficult situation for the whole family if the parents in the family or the mom in the family is being blamed for the family's situation and really kind of gate kept from services. That doesn't help the child.
And does this relate to your concept of refamilialization? Is that well, is that slightly separate or so different?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a relationship. So refamilialization is the idea that some of the hard-won welfare rights that I was talking about before, they were never universal, but they were hard-won rights. These are increasingly, welfare, as we know in the UK, is increasingly being privatized, outsourced, or simply just cut back, and people are kind of told, you are responsible for your own situation. The government, the state has no responsibility. There's no responsibility here. We're putting it back in the family, any of these kind of things that you need to live or survive. So yeah, I guess in this case, that's a good link that you've just made to the concept of refamilialization. So families, more and more, and particularly moms, are held responsible for the situation, even if, there are no jobs, or there are no decent jobs, or to get to the job means you don't have childcare, means you can't actually do the job. I mean, there's all kinds of factors which shape people's ability to survive. But refamilialization says, you're the one responsible, you're the one who's failing here, rather than there's actually a problem with the way the state has organized this support.
I think one of the ways that I really felt relatable to this topic and conversation is because I come from a migrant family too, and I see a lot of these kind of situations playing out. So a lot of these kind of like dynamics that you mentioned, and the welfare, and all of these kind of child exceptionalism ideas, and seeing the reality of it. And so I'm really interested to see what kind of examples you have from the migrant families that you spoke to, and how these ideas were relating to them. Could you tell me a little bit more about who they were and what their daily lives kind of look like?
Yeah, so one part of the research that I do is with, as I said, with families who have no recourse to public funds. So this is a terrible bureaucratic term. I mean, it's just so alienating. But basically, anybody with a time-limited visa in the UK, or anybody with irregular status in the UK, is subject to this condition. And what it means is that people don't have access to regular mainstream welfare benefits, no matter what their situation. And so this welfare, so-called safety net, which is meant to be a universal, is not at all a universal for people living in the UK. These are families where a parent may have migrated to the UK. Children may be born in the UK or have British citizenship, but they have no status in and of themselves. So their parent's status as migrant applies to them. So the whole family has no access to support. So what does that, you were asking me, what does that actually mean? Well, for families that we've worked with, for children that we've done research with, it means things like being unhoused, homeless, people spending nights in A&E, on buses, in parks, because they have nowhere to live. They can't afford anywhere to live. It means accepting the kindness or the horrors of strangers and acquaintances. So if you have nowhere to live, where do you stay? You're, let's say, parents with children, where do you stay? People often end up staying in places where they're not places of choice. They're places where they are reliant on others, and often, a family of 4 or 6 will end up sleeping in a living room of somebody else's house or flat, with the kids sleeping on the floor, often for months or years at a time. For those, I mean, I can go on. There's a lot more to say. I mean, the kind of things that children have told us about these experiences are extreme. So it's often that, everybody, like I said, is sort of squished into one teeny tiny room. People are worried about cooking, about it being in somebody else's house. In some cases, there's the conditions of the housing are really terrible, like no heat in the winter, mold on the walls. So really, really difficult situations. And yet there is no mainstream welfare support available for these families, including children who are British and not British.
Do we
So the
understand?
child exceptionalism, I guess, in this example, falls apart. So this idea is the one of the problems with it is if it's about who's deserving, what keeps happening, we see in our research, is the deserving child doesn't apply to children of migrant parents or migrant children because of the way that systemic racism works.
Do we understand how the welfare system designed to support these children actually fails then? Where is the disconnect? I'm wondering.